I want to follow up the video exercise that we've been doing in Moodle by talking about some of the distinctions that have been raised in the discussions and how some of the cybernetic techniques that we use can actually help us to be a bit clearer about those distinctions. So if we look at the Moodle Discussions, I'm just coming down here and having a look at what we've been talking about. There are some key themes that have been coming out of those discussions, and it's very interesting because we throw these words around, but we're not necessarily always that clear about what they mean. So words like, for example, people and institutions and organisation and education, all of these words that sort of crop up in the discussions and the questions that we've been asking. And because we're not that sure about what they mean, of course, it leads to this continuous process of questioning, which is what we've seen and what I was trying to encourage people to engage in. And we've had some really great questions, I have to say. So let's just start by making a note of some of these words that we've been using: people, organisations, boundaries. So lots of discussion about boundaries. And that, of course, is all about making distinctions. Culture. The culture won't change, or, the culture is a particular way, and so we can't do certain, or can do certain things. And of course, words like education. And these are big words. And trying to understand what the words mean is really what we're about. So what I want to do is just focus on two of those words, and in particular to focus on the words organisations and people. Now, very crudely, we can think about obviously organisations as the organisation chart, and managers and people working for the organisation. And then when we think of people, obviously, actually people fill in those boxes in the organisation chart. So that's the relationship, and really that's the content of many of the discussions that people have been talking about. So where is the boundary between me as a person and the organisation I work in, and the improvements I can make for that organisation? In a sense, that leads us nicely on to this next big word, which is viability. Because the thing that people and organisations have in common is the fact that they manage their viability in one way or another. We have viable people whose bodies operate in a particular way and who manage their doings in daily life, and we have viable organisations that go about their business and make profits and all the rest of it, and also employ people. So but thinking about viability and thinking about this common ground between people and organisations is quite a complex thing. And this is the thing that Stafford Beer really focused on. And so this question, what is a viable body? What's the difference between a viable body and a viable organisation? How does a viable body relate to a viable plant, to a viable cell, or to a viable business? These are the questions which Beer really sort of focused on. And what he basically came up with is a way of identifying a common pattern of thinking about viability, irrespective of the sort of viable system that you might be looking at. And it's explaining his viable system model, which is the description of this pattern, that I want to focus on for the rest of this video. I think the main thing about the VSM is that it's simply a useful way, or it can be a useful way, of making distinctions.
Okay, so let's start by talking about the distinction between the day-to-day operational management of an organisation. So, keeping everything running smoothly, and so on the one hand, that's when we think about management, that's a lot of what we think about is determining who does what the priorities are for the organisation. But there's a different type of thinking, which is strategic thinking. And that's all related to future planning and thinking about directions in which the organisation should change, ways in which things should be adapting. And these are often in a sort of difficult relationship with one another. You often find in many organisations that those who do day-to-day management haven't got much time for those who do strategy and policy, and they say that the strategic people haven't really got much idea about what's going on the ground. And at the same time, those who do strategy and policy struggle to get those who are doing the day-to-day management to look at bigger issues, to look at the broader things. But what their job is, collectively, is to manage a whole group of things that need to be done to keep the business running, and that's what I've represented in these little circles. And the way that those things that need to be done are coordinated is often by establishing company procedures and certain ways of doing things within the organisation, and that's what I'm representing by the triangle on the right hand side there. And sometimes there are direct channels of ordering people to do things and making sure that people have got enough capacity to do things. So there are different ways in which we coordinate the different things that need to be done. And this difficult relationship between sort of strategy and the day-to-day, between higher level thinking and practical thinking, that also needs to be managed or at least monitored in some way. And so you could sort of say above all of this is the sort of deeper issues about what any organisation is about, what the corporate identity is, what the identity of the thing is about, what the big picture is, that ties the way that strategy should link to operational management. So there's a higher sort of level of thinking about this. So this gives us a set of distinctions which allow us to at least talk about organisations, and particularly, I suppose you could think about a manufacturing business, where clearly there are things that need to be done, and clearly there is operational management. And actually, I'm just drawing in that, of course, one of the things that any business, in order to remain viable, needs to know what's going on the shop floor. So there needs to be some sort of feedback mechanism that's bringing back information that comes from what's actually going on and feeding back to the operational managers, sort of auditing. So there needs to be something that needs to be done, there needs to be operational managers, but there also needs to be strategy. There needs to be something which that identifies where the company's going and where the profits are coming from, where the future markets are, and so on. And into all of this there is an environment which is creating things which disrupt or into which the system or whatever the business has to operate within. And that environment affects all levels of organisation. It affects strategy. Strategy constantly looks at the environment and thinks, how's the world changing? What do we need to do to change? It can affect day-to-day operational management. It can affect all of the things that need to be done. There are environmental factors that go cut right across the piece. So this is pretty much the VSN picture. This is a sort of almost an abstract picture of what any viable system might look like, or a way of making distinctions about a viable system. But there's a big question in terms of what are we managing? And of course that really depends on the sort of system that you're looking at. And really the question is, what are those little dots in the bottom circle? What are the components that are trying to be coordinated in your viable system? And again, this is an example of how using something like the VSN can lead us to ask questions, and lead us to sort of, and in asking those questions, it can sort of deepen our understanding about the processes that are really going on. So if we're in a business, for example, you might think of the different departments of a business. So you've got a finance department and some sort of production or manufacturing department, and you also might have a sales department and an accounts, all of these different parts of the business. And those are the things that need to be coordinated, and that's one way of looking at it. It's one set of distinctions. It's quite a useful set of distinctions under certain circumstances, and it often can be helpful to actually try and coordinate the business using those distinctions. Thinking about education in this way, it gets a bit more complicated, because it's actually quite difficult to think about what are the components, what do we make in education. But again, the VSM at least frames the question quite nicely. So we can say, well, are we about making students, or are we about making qualifications? And how does that, if you think about, okay, well, some of those little dots, they're qualifications, or they're students, or are we about sort of engaging with employers, or doing something for the country, However you look at it, the VSM model gives us some way of actually testing out these different distinctions that we might make. There I've got one which I have derived from the work of Nicholas Newman, communication. Maybe those little dots are somehow related to communication. But because the model is there and it's a general model of viability, it helps us to frame these questions. It helps us to give us a way of thinking through really quite difficult, well, very difficult, problems. Now you can also think about people, and perhaps one of the most interesting types of person that we have in education is the learner. So what are the components of managing the viability for the learner? And if we sort of think about our little dots there which are being managed as things to do, then obviously things to do for the learner are things like going to lectures and doing assignments and sitting exams and all the different things that learners have to do, read books. But of course they have to do more than that, because many of them still have to work, and they still have to pay the mortgage and drive cars and travel in and do all sorts of other things which have to be coordinated. And we know, for example, in education, that the problems that learners get into are often not actually related directly to their learning, but to other aspects of their life which threaten their viability as learners. This raises the next issue, which is about the recursion of the VSM. Now basically the recursion of the VSM means that the model that I've drawn here actually reproduces itself in its entirety in each of those little dots that I'm now colouring in red. And in fact each of those little dots effectively represents a System 5, or the identity part of the VSM, of a VSM lower down. And this is, in a way, this is the key to sort of Beer's insight about thinking about viability, because it now gives us a common pattern to think about not just the viability of an organisation, but also the viability of the components of that organisation. So we can start playing around with distinctions and saying, well, institutions are made up of people, and if institutions are made up of people and the institution is viable, but the components of the institutional people, and they too must be personally viable, how does that work? How can we think about that? And again, it raises lots of interesting questions. So I just want to show the link here between the things to be coordinated and the System 5 of the VSM. So you can think about that as an organisation, but you can also think about it as a person. And so many of these issues that came out in our discussions about the boundary between person and organisation, here's a way of thinking through those questions by making some interesting distinctions. And you can see its ties to the identity. So that's it for now. I suppose the most important thing to say is that there aren't as such any answers provided by the VSM, but there are different ways of thinking, and those different ways of thinking open up new ways of questioning the problems that we're faced with, and these problems are very, very difficult. And it's not the only way of doing it. There are other ways of looking at education, and there are other models that we can use which can also throw up different ways of thinking. And I hope in the coming weeks I'll be able to cover some of those as well. Okay, thanks a lot.